Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone to this year's first episode of Causonomics, our podcast which discusses the economic impact of great customer service on the UK. Now, to kick 2025 off, we have the head of one of the UK's most beloved luxury brands. Tom Athron, CEO of Fortnum Mason, joins me this week to discuss how the iconic retailer has continued over many years to delight its customers, often through challenging and changing landscapes. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that you do too. Well, a very warm welcome to everyone that is listening today, and I am so delighted because we are joined today by a very special guest. I love the brand that he looks after and have loved it for many years, but Tom Athron, CEO of Fortnum Mason, such a privilege to know Tom, both on a personal level and also on a professional level. Now, a little bit of background about Tom. Tom started his career in investment banking and then quickly saw the light, I think is what I would say, Tom, and has moved into the retail space where he was both CFO at Waitrose and for 13 years in the John Lewis partnership. So some really interesting pieces for me, Tom, about moving from the finance to the customer experience world, and maybe actually that link between why that is so important. But you also founded JLP Ventures, and that was the innovation unit. So perhaps we'll talk a little bit about that, set up by John Lewis Partnership to identify and growth and new opportunities. And given what we're facing into at the moment, growth is such an important topic. So how we use creativity. And after a 2-year spell as COO at Matches Fashion, you then joined Fortnum Mason as Chief Executive Officer in the height of the pandemic back in 2020. Gosh, you're a glutton for punishment, aren't you, Tom? A really, really warm welcome. So tell us a bit about yourself and that journey. And I'm particularly passionate, as you know, and interested in the link between why customer experience creates such a great outcome, financial outcome for organisations, and what's driven you through your career.
So thank you for having me. What a lovely warm welcome, Joe. I'm listening to that thinking I'm intrigued to hear what I've got to say.
Lots.
You've rattled through my CV, and just listening to that, it just makes me think about the number of different roles that I've had. I've had one of those careers, I think, largely due to the generosity and foresight of the John Lewis partnership, where I have worked across a number of different functions within, I've been in consumer businesses since my late 20s, but I've been given the opportunity to follow a career path which perhaps might be counterintuitive to some. So what I haven't done is, in any of my roles, followed up a particular silo or a particular path within one retail function. I've moved from strategy to buying to finance to business development to venturing and innovation and creativity, and then into an operational role, and now latterly into a CEO role. And I have to say I'm hugely thankful to the John Lewis Partnership for giving me that career. It was one of those organizations where if you put your hand up and you're prepared to put yourself into situations that feel deeply uncomfortable, and what I mean by that is your employer is prepared to put you into roles for which you might, on the face of it, be wholly unsuited, but you're prepared to take that risk and run with it and work really hard and be comfortable with the fact that you don't know everything, then I think that those are the most interesting careers.
And also the fact that you put yourself in that position. So less of a risk for them than perhaps we might have thought, because you're demonstrating desire to learn, to grow, and to see those connections. I think so. It's quite interesting about your career, as you said, going through lots of different roles has created a much more rounded you that are able to lead Fortnum Mason now, because you've actually got the scars, got the experience, and you know what it is like to have done some of those roles. So when you landed at Fortnum Mason, on a serious note, in the middle of the pandemic, Fortnum Mason brand, an iconic brand. It's a kind of scary place to start, isn't it? When you get fabulous to be able to be the CEO, but at a time when there's a lot of change going on, a lot of fear going on. How did that feel? And what did you want to do when you landed into the role? And how have you executed that over the last couple of years?
So I landed at Fortnum's at the beginning of, December 2020. And then I took over in Agba at the beginning of 2021, so January 2021. I'd been working at Matches Fashion before that and had seen that business as an interim CEO actually into the first wave of lockdowns. So yes, there was a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty, and the businesses were all over the place. We're just trying to sort of navigate what they were doing. And if you remember, the characteristics of that lockdown at the beginning of 2021 was that it was going to be deep and dark, and it was likely to last very long. My first day at Fortnum's, I arrived, and the first conversation I had was with a guy called Sean, who was our store director at the time at Piccadilly, who said, we've got a real problem. We've got 60% of our team are ill or self-isolating. We're thinking about having to close the shop. What do you want to do? Asked me this direct question. And I was still carrying my coat and my bag and hadn't found my office or anything like that at this point. And this was about 8 o'clock in the morning. And I said to him, how long have I got to sort of make a decision? And he said, well, we open the shop at 10. People will start leaving home in about half an hour to come to work. It would be great if we could let them know before they leave home. So you've got about half an hour to make this decision, maybe a bit longer. So I went upstairs and I phoned my old boss at Waitrose, a guy called Mark Price. And I said to him, I need some advice. And he said, I thought you might call for some advice, but not before 9 o'clock on your first morning. And he said, his advice was brilliant. He just said, look, I don't think it matters what you decide. There is no right answer to this one. All I'm telling you, though, is that you need to make a decision in the next 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And so I did. And actually, it turned out that we kept the shop open. There was nothing about those numbers that you were looking at on the news every night that was getting any better, and certainly wasn't going to get any better in the next 2 weeks. So I felt we weren't going to shop for a fortnight. This was shutting for months. And I actually felt the right thing to do was to keep the shop open. And that was sort of using some of the decision-making that we'd looked at Matches actually previously. And I'm really glad that we did. And that day, I think we had something like 50 customers. I would say most of them were children. And that was right at the beginning of January 2021. At the end of 2021, so heading into Christmas 2021, the Saturday before Christmas, we had nearly 40,000 people in the shop. So the year was bookended, in my mind certainly, by having 50 customers on my first day and about 35 or 40,000 on my last day.
And a very brave decision, but as you said, the right decision, given the actual place, an iconic building, an iconic brand as well, in terms of being able to keep your doors open. Must have felt pretty proud for your people as well, but obviously quite challenging given none of us really knew what to expect. So during that year, what kind of things have you taken or learnt, I guess, from the pandemic that you've kept going with, Tom? Or is there anything that you thought, well, actually, that was just consigned to history. It was a part of our life that hasn't happened again since and won't. Or were there any lessons that you took from it?
I think as I sort of reflect on that time, I think like all good crises, there's an opportunity buried in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And without wishing to diminish at all what the pandemic meant for some people, for me, at Fortnum's, it represented an opportunity to make some changes that perhaps otherwise might have taken longer. When your shops are sort of barely full of customers, I mean, we had, as I said, a few customers in, all our restaurants were closed, everything had gone online. It seems to me to be an opportunity to refocus the attentions of the business while people were sitting at home. We didn't actually furlough anyone in our business. It was a decision taken by the family, which I have huge respect for. And so we had people who were available to do some work for us. And one of my observations, my early observations about Fortnum's, was that it seems to me that we had this incredible brand, but the experience of our customers was not keeping up with that brand. There was a gap opening up. And so what I felt I wanted to do quite quickly, and with the help of the team, was think about the specific steps that we could take to close that gap really quite quickly and use the advantage of the pandemic and with very little else going on to refocus our transformation program and just focus on the things that were most important to our customers. So what I did, and it seems really simple now, and this wasn't planned, but I have to say, given, if I was to run a business again or start in a business again, I would, I think, do exactly the same thing. I asked for the top 10 things that customers were complaining about.
Yeah.
Grounded in the data. So we looked at our rant and rave data, Trustpilot, complaints data coming into our customer services team, what our own teams were telling us anecdotally about the experience of our customers. And we ranked all of those issues into a list that was effectively triaged. And I took the top 10 and I said, we are only going to focus for the next 9 months on fixing those things at their roots. So not papering over the issues, but taking them right back to their root causes, thinking about what those issues were, where they are buried in the way that we were working, or the systems that we had in place, or technology that we weren't using properly, or processes that weren't working for people. And we said we are just going to focus on fixing those 10 things. And we set up a program, we gave it a name, it's called Program Ruby, and we spent 9 months fixing those things. And we didn't get to the bottom of the list, but we made far more progress than we otherwise would. And the thing that really surprised me about taking that focus was that I worked out quite quickly, actually, that not only were we solving those problems for our customers, but actually what we were doing was making the lives of our employees easier too. And so, removing complexity, giving them the tools to do the job. And it made such a big difference. And actually, we had a successful peak period, actually, the following year. I don't think we'd have been able to do it had we not done that program. And again, I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of that list. In fact, sometimes it feels like I'm sort of further away from that goal than I was before. But part of me thinks it should always feel like that, actually. And I'm really pleased that we did it. And it was a really great place to start. And for me as a new CEO, the other thing that it did was that it firmly planted me in the eyes of my team as someone who was the champion of our customers. And again, that was a really good starting point. And I know when I describe that, it sounds like that's organized and orchestrated, and that was my plan coming in. But it really wasn't, actually. It was me reacting to, as you've described, sort of quite febrile and fast-changing times. And I think that we grasped the nettle on a number of things that others would have done.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it, Tom? Because what that enabled you to do, and perhaps many organisations to do, is to almost get back to basics. When we run organisations, when it is busy and when life is kind of normal, whatever normal is, there's lots of things that are competing for our attention. But by stripping that back to what was really keeping your customers awake at night, you really focused. And interesting, your point about how that also encouraged probably greater commitment from your colleagues, greater engagement from the staff as well, because the two are so related, aren't they? That delivering great customer experience depends largely on having great people in the organisation. And that isn't just about the human part of the organisation, that's about designing systems or processes with the customer in mind. So I think it's really interesting that you have use that time to really focus around what really matters at its heart and at its core, and then everything else radiates out from that. But I think you would have done that, if I was honest, because that's what you were doing at John Lewis, that's what you were doing at Matches. I think it's very interesting when you look at CEOs that are service-led, what do they have in them? They have that desire to really try and understand what's keeping the customer awake at night, solve that, and then work outwards back into the organisation. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that the partnership, the John Lewis partnership, and that's Waitrose and John Lewis, is a really interesting sort of case study in that, because I was there for nearly 15 years and you get immersed in the ideology that sits behind it, and which I have to say I sort of fundamentally believe in. And if you just strip that back to its sort of simplest bit, it's basically happy staff, happy customers. That's the way the John Lewis partnership thinks. And wherever you start in that particular circle, whether or not you start with customers and you end up with employers, or whether or not you start with employees and end up with customers, doesn't really matter. But the partnership is grounded on this principle that really it's about the happiness of its employees. And that happiness is sort of derived from what they describe as worthwhile and satisfying employment and successful business. And so there's a bit of a cycle in there. And again, that's not rocket science. And you can overthink this stuff. But if you look at businesses that I would say really put the customer at the heart of what they do and what they stand for, what you tend to find is that what they're really talking about is putting their employees at the heart of what they stand for. Timpson's is a really good example of that. They pay particular attention to the sorts of people that they're hiring from all sorts of challenging backgrounds and give them an opportunity that I think directly as the result of how it ends up in a better experience for customers. Yeah, I guess you can't think about one without thinking about the other.
Absolutely. And I think the whole profit service chain, we see from all the research at the Institute, the amount of discretional effort the employee puts in, if they feel valued by the organisation, is twice the levels if you don't feel valued. That then results in a better customer experience, and as you and I both know, Tom, over the longer period, that results in better financial results. And that sometimes the challenge is that we're expecting CEOs, boards to deliver now within the immediacy of it. So being able to try and make sure that you have that time, I think in a world where we're very short of time, is probably one of the biggest challenges that any CEO and exec team has to live by at the moment. But it's a really important lesson that I think we need to make sure that we have. Let's talk a little bit about the Fortnum Mason brand, because whether it's the Piccalilli or whether it is the lovely wine bar downstairs, or whether it's Christmas. I mean, Christmas for me, no Christmas is complete without a visit to Fortnum Mason's. There are some really important things that you want to protect and keep, but you also want to modernise that brand. And I know that's something that's very passionate to you. And a heritage can be great, but it can also be a challenge, can't it? So tell me a little bit, Tom, about how you are taking the brand going forward.
It's a really interesting challenge. It's the thing probably I think about most. How do you make sure that you don't lose what you stand for, and all the things that goes to make a brand like Fortnum Mason just the most incredible, sort of rich, sort of visceral experience? Don't lose any of that, but at the same time remain relevant to the changing world. I think that is strategically, that's the big question that I think that a business like Fortnum faces. I had to say, when I got the job, it actually appeared in the paper, which is the first point that my mother heard about it. She read it in the paper and she phoned me. And after sort of congratulating me, she said, the most important thing, please, for God's sake, don't change anything, which I think is a really interesting observation to make, because, and by the way, she's not the only person to have said that to me. Lots of people have said that to me, please don't change it. And I thought a lot about what that means and what people are really telling me. And I think what they're saying is, or certainly the conclusion I've drawn, is that actually it's okay to change everything. You just need to do it without anyone noticing. and that's really the journey we've been on since I've been there. The way I've found to do that, and again, with my fantastic team, we have an exec team, there are 6 of us, or 7 of us actually, including me. And some of them are new and some of them were there when I joined. But coming together with that sort of combined shared understanding of, certainly what Fortnum's is, and a real visceral understanding of what Fortnum's is, but combined with this sense of how do we make it more relevant and modern and up to date. And actually modern is a word I don't particularly like using. Relevant, I do like using. Modern, I'm not so keen on. But that team coming together to really think about it, we spent a lot of time really trying to distill what we wanted Fortnum's to be. And what we alighted on was this idea that Fortnum should just be all about extraordinary food and drink. And when I say that to people, I know it's right, because people say, well, of course that's what Fortnum's is. So I sort of feel like I'm going with the grain on that, which is sort of quite helpful. But what that allows you to do, and it certainly allowed us to do, is that if you start looking at everything you do through the lens of extraordinary food and drink, is it taking us on that journey to being all about extraordinary food and drink, or isn't it? It can be a very sort of defining way of making decisions. And you start to sort of think, okay, well, if extraordinary food and drink sits at the very heart of what Fortnum's is all about, there are sort of concentric circles around that. We don't have to be all food or all drink. But there are things that are connected more or less to food. And what I found was that you can sort of go further and further out. And it started to make us realize that actually there isn't a place for menswear in Fortnum's. And so we closed menswear quite quickly as a result of that. And in its place, we put in a food and drink studio, which was all about bringing to life the theatre of food. So we're doing supper clubs and masterclasses and gin tastings and book launches and drinks parties and chef's tables and all sorts of things in this space in the middle of the shop. We put a gin still in at the end of the room. We've opened a cocktail bar, which is made out of sugar. We've opened the most beautiful cook shop offer, where 90% of the things that are in there are made by people in Britain. In fact, half of those things are made by individual craftsmen. So a wonderful sort of cook shop offer, Japanese knives, all sorts of things. And it just talks to food much more broadly. And it's just a really good example of not only doing things which I think are sort of modern and relevant when it comes to department store retailing, but it really reinforces our credentials in extraordinary food and drink. And I think that's probably, the defining moment in our sort of strategic direction. That, for me, is about not trading on our past, but respecting our past, but making sure that what we do today is relevant, and ideally relevant to more people more often.
Yeah, Tom, I think you've crystallized that about how you take a brand on that journey, not lose its heart and its purpose and retain that, but make sure, as you said, that it is relevant for more people, which is something that I know that you're very passionate about, but also relevant to the world that we are living in. And I can testify, having walked around the different floors in Fortnum, you can get that real sense, and talk to one of your chefs actually fairly recently about his passion. We can feel your passion, but you can also feel their passion for what they are delivering. And that is really special. Actually, Tom, you don't always get that. And that then comes back to the theatre of the experience of what that physical location means to you as well in terms of Piccadilly.
Well, I think the interesting thing, it's really good to hear that the chefs are passionate, and I see that every day. The really interesting thing about being a food business now is that it's not just about being a retailer of food or a restaurant business or a hospitality business or a private dining or events business, which is we're all of those things. But what it also means is that we have to have a very clear point of view on the food agenda more broadly. So if you're going to be all about extraordinary food and drink and making joy, and the idea of Fortnum's is that it just should be entirely joyous, you also have to have a really clear point of view on where food's going. So it's no accident, for example, that Henry Dimbleby has joined our board as a non-exec. He has written a book called Ravenous, which is basically about the food system, the global food system actually, but in particular in relation to the UK. It's a crystallization really of the work that he did when he wrote the National Food Strategy for the government. He left the government and wrote this book, and it really pushes me and my team to really think about the role that we want to play in the future of food debate, whether that's ultra-processed foods, whether it's organic farming or regenerative farming, the impact that we're having on the soil. Do you really need emulsifiers in chocolate? I mean, all of those things are, and actually fundamentally the link between those things and poor health outcomes.
Yeah.
It's really important that Fortnum's has a point of view on that. So we have our Food and Drink Awards every year, which are designed to elevate and shout about the broadcasters, the content creators, the digital creators, and the stories that they're telling, as well as using our Food and Drink Studio as a place where we can convene people together and talk about food in a really cool way. And I'm really, really enjoying that. And actually, it's all part of being a proper modern food business. You cannot be in my industry and not have a really clear point of view. And by the way, set some ambitions around it too.
Yeah, and that's very, very clear. And some of the things that you've touched on in a world which is more stretched, in a world where, climate change, amongst other things, the supply chain, all of that is under much greater stress. So having that provenance and really understanding about quality, what you're talking about is quality.
It's really interesting, this idea of quality, because every business has a sustainability agenda. What I want Fortnum's to have is a sustainability agenda where everyone in the business is totally clear why it's important. Because I think a lot of businesses do it, but they never ask the question why. Or if they do ask the question why, it's, we're under a bit of pressure from some of our stakeholders or our suppliers or our customers are asking us questions. For me, when we think about sustainability, we thought a lot about our sort of fundamental beliefs that sit behind our sustainability agenda. And we came up with this idea. I was talking to one of the chefs and I said, why do you think we're doing it? And he said, and he basically summarized it. He said to me, the thing is, what I notice as a chef, we have 100 chefs who work in Piccadilly. And he said, the more care you take in sourcing your food and really understanding the impact it has on the seabed or the soil or the communities from which it's sourced, the more care you take, the better the food tastes. And I'm thinking, well, that's a brilliant reason to be really cool and excited about sustainability, because it comes back to, for me, it comes back to the sort of this ultimate purpose of Fortnum's, which is just to make joy. So I find that a very easy and sensible and galvanizing, organizing thought when it comes to sustainability more broadly.
And a circle. It completes itself too, doesn't it? So what you're saying about is a brilliant outcome, but that's because the thought has gone through every single part of that touchstone, right from the very beginning of where it's sourced from to how they treat it. Because I think also if you get the ingredients delivered to you in a nice way, if you look after that, if you care about it, it creates a much better outcome. Reminds me a bit of my mum's cooking, really, Tom. It's the same kind of principle about really going back to only putting things in there that actually need to be in there, only really caring about, where has that come from? So I think it's, it definitely makes the Fortnum Mason brand relevant.
So I think we now spend much more time asking ourselves, really understanding why certain things go into certain foods. I think we can take a real stand on ultra-processed food, actually. And I know we're a purveyor of chocolate and sugar and biscuits and cheese and those sorts of things. And I understand that. But that's not to say that we can't make real progress and actually be a bit of a guiding light. We're small enough and nimble enough, and we have a supply base which has been with us for so long in some of those key categories that I would like to make some really ambitious progress on ultra-processed foods over the course of the next few years. I'm really excited about that.
And really important, as you said, to the health of the nation as well, let alone, as we've said, some of the issues around climate, sustainability in its broadest sense. And by the way, I think a little bit of decent chocolate at high-grade quality has got to be good for you anyway, hasn't it? Because it's also about the mental health as well as physical health.
I totally agree with that. And one of the things that's most important to me, the idea that Fortnum's, our biscuits come in beautiful tins, our chocolates come in beautiful boxes. But the truth is, if they're not the very best biscuits or the very best chocolates or the very best marmalade, then ultimately customers will find us out. And so the most important thing to me is that, and the way I like to describe it, is the food justifies the label. But I never want to be in a situation where the label is justifying our food, because it's seductive and it probably will drive trade in the short term, but it is flawed. That's not us investing in the strength and quality of our brand.
And that is really clear. And you can feel it just sitting talking to you today, that passion, that commitment, which is not about marketing. It's not about the fluff. What you're talking about, the substance of the quality of the product that you are creating. And I also think too, when you have a high grade quality product, we probably a little less of it in a funny way because you treasure it more, don't you? It's a bit like, well, I won't eat the whole bar. I'll actually just have bits of the chocolate too.
My view on this is, you're absolutely right, is that chocolate should not be a staple part of your everyday diet. That if they do eat chocolate, they should try and eat the very best chocolate they can.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I would definitely sign up for that too. Tom, I could talk to you all day, and I'm conscious of your time, but I just want to come on to a little bit about, we can't get through any conversation at the moment without talking about AI, talking about technology. You have modernized or made more relevant, not just your product, but what you've talked about, the systems and the services that you are delivering. And we as a country need to achieve growth. So we want, don't we, more people to come into service to be able to drive that agenda going forward. What, therefore, do you see the split or the relevance of making sure that we deploy technology and AI appropriately, but don't forget the human elements of the service agenda? So how do you see that developing?
I think it's a really interesting question. And it's something that we talk about a lot, actually, because we trouble ourselves with this. The way I think about it is, we're looking for our own productivity opportunities, as every business is and should be. Ultimately, businesses need to be more productive, but we also need to make sure that we're driving growth. And the best way to ensure that you're driving growth is to deliver an amazing service experience for your customers. And so if I can find opportunities to deploy AI or technology or automate things, and this doesn't just have to be in our customer services operation, it could be in our logistics operation, it could be in the way that we manage our finances or push our HR teams to be more productive, whatever it might be. The way to think about it, I think, is to sort of say, if you prioritize a customer experience over productivity, then it will always be the right thing to do. So, for example, if you are thinking about outsourcing or offshoring your customer services team, what I would say to businesses is, if the answer to the question is this going to result in a better experience from our customers? If the answer to that is no, but it's going to be cheaper, I would encourage people not to do it.
Yep.
But if the answer is actually it's going to allow you to be more productive, and we think it's going to result in a better experience for our customers, objectively measured, then I think it's worth thinking about. Businesses that are seeking to put productivity at the head of the journey rather than customers, I think are ultimately that particular initiative is doomed to fail, either in the short term, medium term, or long term. At some point, it won't work. But if you put customers at the heart of that thinking, it's fine. And so on that basis, there are things that I think are worth investing in when it comes to things like artificial intelligence or using bots or whatever it might be that result in a better customer outcome. A really good example of that is very simple, from a retailer's perspective, very simple Wizmo queries. So a Wizmo query is where is my order? Customers are always phoning up and saying, where is my order? Not that it's late. I just want an update. Where is it in the process? How can I track where it is in the system? Have you processed it yet? When can I expect it to be dispatched? When do you think it's going to be delivered? There is no reason for a customer necessarily to speak to a human if they don't want to on those sorts of things. They can be answered very quickly, probably more accurately, and for less, for sure, if they go through one of the automated channels. And by the way, that might be as simple as just going as the account page on your site and checking their own order details. That might give them the answer that they need. But the reason I'm keen on those sorts of things as being very relevant for things like AI is not necessarily because it's cheaper, but for two other reasons. First of all, you're likely to get a quicker answer by doing that than you would having waited to speak to someone. But the other reason is that by taking those things off the list of a call center, you're freeing up agents to speak to people who've got more complicated issues to solve. By doing that, you're providing a better experience for those people who really do need help. That's a good way of thinking about it. So I would encourage people to prioritize the customer experience and not productivity in this. If you prioritize productivity, but for a customer experience which is less good, you will never win.
And I think also what you're talking about, Tom, which is a theme that I'm warming to greatly, is the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. Because if you are effective in being able to deliver that, you can also drive greater efficiency.
That's the way I describe it.
And I think sometimes we chase efficiency and equate often efficiency with cost saving. And actually, if we think, as you said, far more through what's the outcome that we're trying to deliver to and what is the best way to deliver to that outcome for the customer, then you hopefully will become, if you've got a genuinely open mind, more effective and hopefully more efficient. And I think some of the problems we've got at the moment is trying to do it the other way around. And that's not about selling a system or selling a solution. It's much more about thinking and asking the right questions. One of the things at the Institute we are very keen, because we get asked about AI and technology all the time, is to encourage those that are responsible for this to ask the relevant questions and to think about what's the outcome we're trying to deliver to, not, all the time about the inputs, because I think sometimes that's the other thing. I mean, you talked about relevance. We're big on relevance. Is that still relevant? We're big on impact. And we're big on purpose for me. So, trying to align all of those elements to say, well, what is the purpose of us doing that? Is that still relevant? And what outcome are we trying to drive from a customer viewpoint gets us a much better place, I would argue.
Focusing on outcomes is a brilliant way to think about it. And too many businesses run on inputs. And what you should really be focusing on is delivering outcomes.
So we can put the world to rights, which we clearly are, Tom, and I'm very grateful, as I said, for your time. If we were thinking about, we talked about reputation, we talked about brand, we talked about provenance and where something comes from and purpose, and you're crystal clear in that. You've also talked about your people. You've said the tone from the top is everything, particularly when you are under pressure in creating satisfying or fulfilling work for our people. So we're on a bit of a mission to talk about service as a profession. We have a funny relationship with service, I think, in the UK, and bearing in mind that 80% of our GDP is driven from the services sector, and bearing in mind that 60% of our workforce are in some form of service-related role. What can we do more of to promote customer experience, customer as a profession? Because we want more people like you with the innovation and the creativity to come into this space. And I fear at the moment that we're not driving that sufficiently. So how do we get the profession, the customer service profession, more respected and more seen to be the place to start your career and develop your career?
Well, I think that we need to stop thinking about customer services as call centers. Fundamentally, I mean, as I said, I've worked in the consumer industries pretty much my entire career. What I'd say about that is that pretty much every single job that employees do in this particular industry is related to service in some sort of way. And so whether you are, what I talk about at Fortnum is if you work in finance, or if you work in HR, or if you work in tech, or if you work in logistics, you are all somehow pointing towards a service experience for our customers. And that might be direct or it might be indirect. But the point is that there is a service element to every single role that is done, certainly in a business like mine. And actually, sitting here now, I actually can't think of a business, whether you're in oil and gas or telecoms or airlines or whatever, it's not just retail, where that isn't true. So somehow putting service at the heart of every single job and not restricting service to those roles that we constantly sort of revert back to and think that that's customer service. And I don't think calling your customer services team is a particularly helpful starting point. But just helping people understand that everything they do ultimately points to a better experience for your customers. is where I would start.
It's really interesting, Tom. I used to work for a boss who said to me, you better be serving the end customer or serving somebody who is serving the end customer, otherwise you have no relevance to me. And I think that's a really good way of, really helping us all to understand that ultimately the customer pays our jobs. That is a really important aspect. And to your point, whether you work in finance, whether you work in IT, and whatever industry sector you work in, even in manufacturing, we are all delivering to the outcome for the customer and all have a really important part to play. And I would argue it's much more exciting now because we've talked about AI, we've talked about technology taking processing away, which was never really service in my mind. That's processing. To be able to now really concentrate on things like higher levels of empathy, critical thinking, problem solving, the ability, and we're going to need a lot more of that, thinking holistically to be able to solve the challenges that our businesses are facing into now and will be facing into.
I think it's right. The way I think about it is, for too long, I think businesses, retailers, that sort of is the example I know, businesses think in sort of channels, or in, and people talk about working in silos and all that sort of thing. The way to really solve these problems is to think about these issues systemically. If I go back to what I was talking about earlier with Program Ruby, if you start to take things right back to their roots, it's extraordinary where you find out where actually the problem really sits. And it'll be buried in someone's role or some system that has knock-on unintended consequences as you pull the thread and you sort of lead it all the way through the business. If you start to think about things systemically, so, for example, if a merchandiser is dealing with a supplier, that merchandiser needs to consider the needs of the logistics operation rather than just assume that the product will land. And, a really good example would be, if I get really specific, is that we had our jams delivered in trays of 6.
Yeah.
Which seems very sensible and seems very simple. And that's the way the supplier was delivering the jams to us, and it sort of made perfect sense. It's only when you go to the logistics operation and then you actually see that in order to start packing hampers, the picker needs to pick six packs of jams off the tray and put them on the trolley. Whereas actually if they were delivered in 24s, it would save them about 10 seconds. And 10 seconds multiplied by 100 people multiplied by 10 hours multiplied by 365 days a year is an awful lot of time and effort and energy. So if you work in merchandising, understand the impacts that the decisions that you are having on other parts of the business is a really, really important thing. And I think it's back to my career, it's one of the advantages in having worked in all these different areas that I do sort of see threads drawn between different parts of the business where perhaps I wouldn't had I only worked in one function.
So maybe that's also another thing that we should encourage for people to work in as many different parts of a business to understand the totality of it. Because I think I agree with you. Once you've worked in different industry sectors, once you've worked in different roles, you kind of see the lens slightly differently, don't you? You see it through the challenges and the issues that were in that particular area, and things feel much more aligned and integrated. They're not separate things. And I think sometimes as businesses, we forget that. They're departments, they're functions, they're silos, when actually if we can move in a much more integrated way and the customer is the thread.
I think our labour market, because it's so liquid, it values specialisation.
Yes.
So if you're looking for someone who's got particular experience in selling marmalade in Qatar on Tuesdays, you will find someone who's got that particular experience, and we value that specialization. Whereas I think in a world where you're trying to solve problems systemically, you need people to think across the whole spectrum of the activities that are undertaken in a particular business. And that requires a different mindset and it requires a different training. And, I'll go back to the John Lewis partnership in this and my career, the question you asked me earlier. I think the reason I call that out is because there are very few businesses who I do think do that. I think businesses are reluctant to take a risk on people in the sense that they'll put them into jobs they've never worked before or departments that they've never worked before. And indeed, employees feel comfortable in doing what they've always done and sort of working their way up the chain because the job sort of develops over a period of time. So I would love to see employers be braver in taking risks on people. And I would love to see people who are up for it put their hand up and say, I wouldn't mind doing something fundamentally different and you taking a risk on me.
And maybe, the service profession is a great way to be able to lead that charge and enable people to do that. Because I agree completely, Tom, on a personal level, I spent my formative years in general insurance. and was fortunate enough to work for an organisation that enabled me to work in lots of different departments. Without that, I would have never have been able to see the connection. And I think it's interesting about building a horizontal career might be more interesting than keep going up and down the stove.
Well, I mean, the idea that you know what you want to do when you're 25 for the rest of your career is just a joke. So people who find themselves in buying or merchandising or finance or HR or tech or wherever, the idea that you join a tech team and then spend your life in tech seems to be the norm, but my view is that it shouldn't be.
No, I agree completely. And something we're going to return to. Tom, as I said, conscious of your time, so we're going to ask you one final question. What is the one change business leaders can implement today to change the future of customer service? Maybe it's one of the things we've already talked about, really, Tom, but what would you like to see done?
I mean, there isn't one thing. But if I was to pick a couple of them, I would say in my business, introducing a hospitality mindset into retail is a really interesting idea. So if you're a retailer, don't treat your customers like they're retail customers. Treat them like you would if they were coming into your restaurant. Greet them, look them in the eye, smile, check that they're okay. So in other words, I think what I'm really talking about is form a human interaction with people and not one that is somehow automated or process driven. Rely on your human instincts to develop proper emotional, meaningful relationships with people. That is easier said than done. But the way I like to think about that is to introduce a hospitality mindset into a retail operation. That's the challenge I pose to my team. And I really like that idea. I'm going to say two rather than one. The other thing I would say is that if you were to focus on one thing, focus on the people who are complaining. Because, well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're really trying to tell you something. Yeah. It will never be an isolated incident. What that is a bigger issue bubbling to the surface. So for every one person complaining, there are probably 1,000 people who have experienced the same thing, but haven't been bothered to complain. Complaints are a gift, right? They are giving you a gift. And so you take them really seriously. And what I do is, if someone has a bad experience and they write to me at Fortnum's, I won't solve their problem directly myself, but I will always acknowledge in person that they've written to me. I will write them a note and say, thank you. I will pass them on to the team. That, by the way, just takes the heat out of the moment as much as anything else. But goodness me, you can learn so much about the themes that begin to emerge over the course of time. And I am a firm believer in the view that someone who's complained and you've resolved it brilliantly will be a better customer than they were had they never complained in the first place. So I would say those two things. So just don't forget the humanity and listen to the complaints. If I was to do those two things, I think that you're on pretty good ground.
Brilliant. Tom, as always, an absolute pleasure. Thank you for giving your time to us today and for your wisdom. And it's really, really interesting to hear both about your career, but also the Fortnum Mason story. And we will continue to watch. And I shall definitely be in the shop this Christmas looking for various nice treats. And I definitely will still be buying a bit of chocolate, I've got to say.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom.
Lovely to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Causonomics, and hopefully this conversation has given you some renewed inspiration as you drive your businesses forward over the coming weeks and months. And please do join us next week, where we're going to be moving back to the world of financial services, when I have a chat to the brilliant Alison Rose about challenges facing the heavily regulated sector, but also how she has worked throughout her whole career to really demonstrate and drive the return of investment of customer service. So until then, please do go safely.